No filler, just pure thriller. Get your daily dose of intense, high-quality narratives and cinematic excellence that pushes the boundaries of digital media. We tell the stories that stick with you. Click subscribe now and join our growing community today. The IV pole was still beside my hospital bed when my husband walked in with a manila envelope. I'd been admitted 2 days earlier. The doctor had used words like mass and we need to act quickly and we'll know more after the biopsy. My mother had cried in the hallway when she thought I couldn't hear her. My sister had flown in from Phoenix overnight. My husband arrived on the second day, after work. He set the envelope on the bedside table, next to my water cup and the small photograph my mother had brought from home, me and my father, taken at my college graduation, the two of us squinting into the afternoon sun. "I've been talking to a lawyer," he said. "I think this is the right time." I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. He was wearing the blue tie I'd given him for our 7th anniversary. He hadn't loosened it. "You want a divorce," I said. It wasn't a question. "I think it's better for both of us if we do this cleanly. Before things get complicated. Before things get complicated." I was waiting for a biopsy result that would determine whether I had 6 months or 6 years. My husband was worried about complicated. I picked up the envelope. I didn't open it. I set it on my lap and looked at the window, at the gray October sky over the parking garage across the street. "Okay," I said. He looked surprised. I think he'd expected crying. Maybe begging. We had been married for 9 years. We had a house in Raleigh with a hydrangea bush I'd planted the spring after we moved in. We had a dog named Walter who slept at the foot of the bed and hated everyone except me and the mail carrier. We had a joint account and a 5-year plan and a trip to Portugal we'd been saving for since 2019. "Okay," I said again. "Leave it with me." He left 20 minutes later. He squeezed my hand at the door, an odd, formal gesture, like we'd just finished a business meeting. The nurse who came in to check my blood pressure didn't say anything, but she looked at the envelope on my lap and then at my face, and something in her expression told me she had seen this kind of thing before. What my husband didn't know, what he had no reason to know, because I had been very careful, was that I had met with my own attorney 8 days earlier. Not because I suspected anything. I want to be clear about that. I hadn't found messages on his phone or noticed him pulling away or any of the things you hear about in hindsight when someone tells you they should have known. I'd met with my attorney because of my father. My father died 4 years ago. He was a quiet man who built things with his hands and trusted almost no one, and the one thing he trusted least was the idea that love was enough to protect what you'd worked for. Before he passed, he spent 2 years restructuring everything he owned. The house in Asheville where I grew up. The rental property on the west side of town. A small commercial building he'd bought in 1987 for almost nothing and leased to a dry cleaner for 30 years. He put all of it into a trust. He named me the sole beneficiary. And before he signed anything, he sat across from me at his kitchen table and said, "This isn't about your husband, this is about you. This is yours. Do you understand?" I told him I understood. I didn't, not fully, not then. When the doctor first used the word mass, my mind went to practical things. That's how I'm wired. I'm an accountant, have been since I was 26, when I passed my CPA exam on the first attempt and my father took me to dinner and ordered a bottle of wine we couldn't really afford. Practical things. Insurance coverage. Power of attorney. The question of what was mine and what was ours and what the difference would mean if things went wrong. So 8 days before my husband walked into my hospital room with a manila envelope, I drove to my attorney's office and I asked her a direct question. If something happens to me, and my marriage is still intact, what can my husband claim? The answer was more complicated than I expected and simpler than I feared. The trust my father had created was protected. My husband had no claim to it, not to the Asheville property, not to the rental income, not to the commercial building that had appreciated to a value my father would not have believed. What I'd built on my own before the marriage was also largely protected. What we had built together, the house in Raleigh, the joint savings that was marital property, subject to equitable distribution under North Carolina law. My attorney walked me through everything. She was thorough and unhurried, and at the end she asked if I wanted to make any changes to my existing documents while I was there. I thought about my father at the kitchen table. This is yours. Do you understand? I made several changes. I updated my beneficiary designations. I amended a clause in my own will that had been there since before I understood what it actually meant. I signed where she told me to sign, and I initialed where she told me to initial, and when I left her office that afternoon, I stopped in the parking lot and stood in the cold for a moment and felt, for the first time since the doctor's appointment, like I could breathe. 6 days later, the biopsy came back benign. 2 days after that, my husband came in with the envelope. I did not tell him about the attorney visit. I did not tell him that I had sat in that office and quietly, methodically made sure that everything my father had built and everything I had built was exactly where it needed to be. I signed his divorce papers 11 days after I had signed my own. And when he left the hospital room with his blue tie and his clean hands, I watched him go and felt something I didn't have a name for yet, not quite grief, not quite relief. Something in between. My sister came back that evening with takeout and bad reality television, and I didn't tell her about the papers either. I just ate my food and watched strangers argue on a screen, and thought about the hydrangea bush in the front yard, and whether he would try to sell the house quickly, or whether he'd want to wait until spring. He called his lawyer from the hospital parking lot. I found this out later, from a series of events I could not have predicted and did not plan. His lawyer, a man I had never met, whose name I learned later was Gerald, apparently told my husband that my father's estate had been quite substantial and that in a divorce proceeding there might be grounds to argue that some of the trust assets had been commingled with marital funds over the years. This was not a strong argument. My attorney had specifically ensured there was no commingling. But Gerald apparently believed it was worth exploring, and my husband apparently believed Gerald. And so for the 3 weeks between my hospital discharge and the moment he first spoke to my attorney directly, my husband had convinced himself that he was walking away from 9 years of marriage with a significant settlement. My attorney called me on a Tuesday morning, the week after I got home. His lawyer made contact, she said. He's going to request full financial disclosure. He believes the trust is accessible. Is it? No, she said. Not even close. She explained what would happen next. It would take a few weeks. There would be paperwork. Gerald would eventually realize that the trust had been properly structured. That there was no commingling. That the assets I had protected were protected cleanly and completely. My attorney's voice was calm throughout. The way someone speaks when they have delivered this kind of news many times. He's going to be disappointed, she said. Yes, I said. He is. I was sitting at my kitchen table when she called. Walter was asleep under my chair, one paw resting on my foot. Through the window I could see the hydrangea bush, bare now in November, just sticks and dry leaves. My husband had moved out 2 weeks earlier, into an apartment across town. He had taken his clothes and his golf clubs and the espresso machine he'd bought 3 Christmases ago and that I had never learned to use properly. He had left the photograph of us at Niagara Falls, which we'd visited on our 3rd anniversary. It was still on the shelf above the fireplace. I hadn't decided yet what to do with it. I thought about the moment in the hospital when he set the envelope next to my water cup. I thought about before things get complicated. I thought about the dry cleaners building my father had bought in 1987, which was now worth 11 times what he paid for it, and which my father had placed in trust for me because he understood something I was still learning. That protection is not a lack of faith. It is its own form of love. Gerald's formal letter arrived at my attorney's office the following Monday. She responded on Wednesday. By Friday, Gerald had done enough research to understand the situation clearly. My husband called me that Saturday. I let it go to voicemail. He called again Sunday morning. I let that go too. On Sunday afternoon he texted a long message that I read once and then set my phone face down on the counter and went to take Walter for a walk. The message said he thought we should talk. That he'd been scared when I was in the hospital and he hadn't handled it well. That he still cared about me. That maybe what we needed was not a divorce but a conversation. I walked Walter 3 miles through the neighborhood, past the elementary school and the little park where we used to get coffee on Sunday mornings, and I thought about what it means to make a decision. Not a reactive decision, not a decision made in fear or anger or confusion, but a real one. A quiet one. The kind you make at an attorney's desk on a Tuesday afternoon when no one is watching, and no one is asking, and you have all the time in the world to think clearly. I had made mine 8 days before he made his. When I got home, I gave Walter a treat and washed my hands and picked up my phone. I texted my husband back one sentence. My attorney will be in touch. I put the phone in my pocket and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the hydrangea. In the spring, I knew it would come back. It always did. The sticks and the dry leaves and the bare November look of it, that was just what it needed to do before it could bloom again. My father had taught me that. He planted the one in Asheville when I was 7 years old, and every fall I thought it had died, and every spring he'd put his hand on my shoulder and say, "Watch. Just wait and watch." I was still the sole beneficiary of the trust. I was still the owner of record for the rental property and the commercial building, both of which generated income I would now keep entirely. I was still healthy. That word had begun to feel enormous to me, healthy, like a room I kept walking into and needing to appreciate all over again. I was still an accountant with a good practice, and a client list I'd spent 15 years building. I still had Walter and the house in Raleigh and a trip to Portugal I hadn't cancelled, just postponed. My husband had a studio apartment across town and a lawyer named Gerald who had misunderstood the assignment. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in February. My attorney sent me a brief email. All done. Congratulations on your fresh start. I was at my desk when it came through, mid-morning, reviewing a client's quarterly estimates. I read the email twice, set down my coffee, and looked out my office window at the parking lot below. A woman was loading groceries into her car. A man was helping a small child navigate a curb. An older couple walked past arm in arm, moving slowly, not in any hurry. Normal Thursday morning things. The kind of things that happen while everything else changes. I thought about my father, about that kitchen table, about the afternoon I sat across from him and he looked at me with that steady, serious face of his and said, "This is yours." I thought about how I'd nodded like I understood and how understanding had actually taken years, had required, in the end, an ivy pole and a gray October sky and a man in a blue tie setting an envelope next to my water cup. I thought about what my attorney had done for me, and what my father had done before that, and what I had done for myself on a Tuesday afternoon when I was scared and thinking clearly, and those two things, I had learned, were not opposites. I replied to my attorney's email. "Thank you for everything." Then I went back to my client's quarterly estimates, because there was work to do, and I have always been good at work, and outside my window it was a perfectly ordinary February morning, which is its own kind of gift when you know what it cost. That evening I called my sister. We talked for 2 hours. I told her most of it, not all. Some of it I'm still keeping for myself. The way you keep certain things, not out of secrecy but because they belong to you. Because they are yours. Because your father looked you in the eyes at a kitchen table and made sure of it. In March the hydrangea came back. Of course it did.